From NPR in Los Angeles, I'm Tavis Smiley. Happy Thanksgiving. On today's program, part one of a special report on the political and economic status of indigenous people in the U.S. and around the world. Our regular commentator, Michael Eric Dyson, offers a few thoughts on Thanksgiving, and we'll hear how the music created by the husband and wife duo Kindred the Family Soul has become more than a family affair. But first, the Thanksgiving holidays are a time when Americans traditionally take time to reflect on our nation's history, to ponder how far we've come and the distance we have yet to go. But too often we only scratch the surface of yesterday. One academic who's measured the past in arguably broader terms than depicted in many American textbooks is Howard Zinn, historian, social activist, playwright, and author of the critically acclaimed A People's History of the United States. Zinn's name has come up in the context of everything from the 1997 Academy Award-winning film Good Will Hunting to Who's Who in America. Here today to help broaden our historical perspective is Howard Zinn, who joins us from Auburndale, Massachusetts. Professor, nice to have you on.
Oh, thank you very much.
Professor Zinn, in both your writings and actions, you have long championed economically and politically dispossessed people in this country and abroad. You've also been openly critical of the kind of history we are taught and suggest that there is a miseducation of sorts that makes its way into the American cultural consciousness. You maintain that key events are omitted in what could be described as establishment American history, while others are given more focus. With that said, before we get into some specific examples of historical omissions, I think it might be helpful then to address the very idea of history. That is to say, history with a capital H. I guess what I'm getting at is, whose history is it, and is that an important question, first of all, to even be asking?
Well, that is the most important question anyone can ask about history. Because if you don't ask that question, if you don't ask, who does the history, well, what's behind it, what's the point of view behind history, then you're an innocent, and then you're subject to whatever history is given to you. Then you're given a big fat history text, and you say, well, this is so big, it must include everything, and you don't question anything. Probably the most important thing anybody can learn when they're just beginning to think about history is that history is very subjective. History is always opinionated. It's never objective. It's never neutral. Because when you think about it, all the history that's presented to you is a selection made by the historian out of an enormous amount of data. The historian decides for you what is important and puts that down in the history book. And what the historian thinks is important may not be important to you. And when I read the history books, even in graduate school, and listened to my teachers, I found that so much of what I thought was important was missing from these books and missing from these lectures. And so I felt that the American people, particularly the young generation going to school, was getting a very inadequate education about the American past.
Let me talk about the American past and some of those omissions that you've talked about and written about specifically. Our time is limited. Let's first talk about the omissions relative to Native Americans. Can you first give us a snapshot of how the indigenous peoples of this part of the world have been portrayed historically?
Well, first of all, the treatment of our history with the Indians, with the indigenous population, is a very weak, inadequate treatment. I remember going to school, and I would learn about the Indians who came to Thanksgiving dinner gratefully. And I would learn about Custer's Last Stand. I would learn about Sitting Bull. There are a few moments in Indian history we learn about. What we didn't learn about was the fact that the American colonists who came here from the beginning were invading Indian soil and driving the Indians out of their land and committing massacres in order to persuade the Indians that they had better move. And the history of the United States is a history of hundreds of little wars fought against the Indians, annihilating them, pushing them farther and farther and farther into a smaller and smaller piece of the country. And finally, in the late 19th century, sort of taking the Indians that were left and squeezing them onto reservations and controlling them. I mean, this is a history that is not told in most American textbooks. The story that's not told is the deceptions that were played on the Indians, the treaties that were made with them, and treaties then broken by the American government. It's important to know that, because if you know that, then you will become aware that the American government is can lie. It can deceive people. It can do it not only in relation to Native Americans, it can do it in relation to all of us.
If I could refer to these as three of the big omissions, let me move from Native Americans to the second of these big omissions, that being the history of African Americans in this country. Is the history of black folk in America adequately told even today?
Not even today, not even after the civil rights movement. And we've had some improvement. That is, we have black history and we have African American studies programs. And so there's been an improvement in the study of black history. But it's still inadequate in that the point of view of black people is still very poorly portrayed. When you look at history from the standpoint of African Americans, everything really looks different. Our heroes are different. Andrew Jackson, who is very often looked upon as sort of a democratic hero in our textbooks, no, he was a slave owner. Abraham Lincoln, yes, a kind man, but he didn't really move for emancipation until he was pushed by the anti-slavery movement, by the black and white abolitionists. We talk about the progressive era in American history in the early part of the 20th century, and we call it the progressive era, even though that's the time in which more black people were lynched in this country, thousands of them, than any other period in American history. So the things that have happened in relation to black people, what they have suffered in this country, I mean, not just under slavery, but after slavery, that's been neglected. And one very important thing, what's been neglected is the fact that the national government was always collaborating with the South in maintaining racial segregation. Even after the 14th and 15th Amendments were added to the Constitution, the national government, every single president for almost 100 years, from the end of the Civil War to the 1960s, every single president ignored the 14th and 15th Amendments and allowed the South to do what it wanted to black people. That's a story that has been very much omitted from our history books.
Big omission number 3, at least for the purposes of our conversation today, the labor movements. Talk to me about how the labor movements are given short shrift in history books even today.
Well, when I was going to school, I remember that, and I don't think it's changed very much, that is, the economic development of the United States was presented sort of as a great triumphal march, a wonderful thing. The United States, after the Civil War, becomes a leading economic power in the world. And we were taught about the great industrialists, about the railroad magnates, and about Rockefeller and Carnegie and Harriman and Hill. But what is left out of that story is the working people. When I studied history in school, even up through the graduate level, I did not learn about the immigrants who worked on the Transcontinental Railroad, the Irish and Chinese immigrants who worked on that railroad and died in great numbers, long hours, sickness, overwork. I did not learn about the girls who worked Lowell textile mills, went into the job at the age of 12, died at the age of 25. I didn't learn about the people who worked in Rockefeller's oil refineries or in his coal mines or in Andrew Carnegie's steel mine. I didn't hear about the history of labor struggle in this country. Didn't hear about the Lawrence Textile Strike of 1912 or the Colorado Coal Strike of 1913-14. It's very important for people to learn about the history of the labor struggle, because otherwise they would think that whatever gains working people have made, like the 8-hour day, they would think it came from Congress or the president. No. Whatever gains working people have made in this country have come from their own efforts, from their struggles, from their strikes, their boycotts, their facing off the police and the National Guard. It's a very important lesson for people, because it's not a lesson just for the labor movement. It's a lesson for all of us. It tells us that if we are going to achieve any justice in this country, we are not going to get it from the initiative of the government. We are going to get it because citizens organize, get together, and they agitate and they demonstrate. This is what they did in the Civil Rights Movement and the movement against the war in Vietnam and the women's movement, Native American movement. Citizens get together, they organize, they protest, they commit civil disobedience. They create a new atmosphere in the country, and then something changes. That's the most important thing people could learn from a history of this country.
Never enough time to talk about history, obviously, but let me ask you this as an exit question, Professor Zinn. When all is said and done, what would you recommend people do, old and young, when it comes to the question, the notion of studying history? How can people approach this first on an individual level and also at an institutional level?
Well, I think on an institutional level, people ought to examine the courses that are given in their institution, their college, and see to it and ask for courses in labor history, courses in women's history, courses in African American, Native American history. They see to it that people who represent these various groups are added to the faculties of the institutions. On a personal level, I think it's very important for people to go outside of the classroom and outside of the curriculum, to go to the library. The library is the best source of independent information, and there they will find materials that don't come up in their classrooms. There they will find a new kind of history. That's what young people can do today if they want to really educate themselves about history.
All right, so I lied. One other exit question right quick. Revisionist history. What do you say to those who might argue that someone like Howard Zinn is simply throwing a wrench in this solid American history with his particular brand of scholarship, that he's really just trying to rewrite history to reflect a liberal agenda?
They're absolutely right. You're trying to rewrite history to reflect the point of view of those people who have been left out. Because the kind of history that we've had so far has been history from the top, history written from the point of view of politicians and generals and militarists and industrialists. And yes, I want to change that history so that people can get an idea of what ordinary people have suffered and what ordinary people have done to change their lives.
Social activist, historian, playwright Howard Zinn is Professor Emeritus of Political Science at Boston University and author of A People's History of the United States. Professor Zinn, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure, sir.